How did it go for him without the mic? Was it all right? Good enough? Okay, I'll give it a try then too. I want to thank you all for coming here and to participate in this really interesting conference. Most of my work, as you heard in the introduction, has been about values and quality of life and such like that. And it wasn't really until I met John DeGraff at the Fetzer Institute some years ago that I started to think in any serious way about time issues. And so I have to say that a lot of what I'm going to present today, and at least in terms of my own research, is inspired in a very direct way by meeting John DeGraff. So I want to thank him for that. And some of also what I'm going to say here is going to overlap with things that John told you earlier, only as a scientist I'm going to show you some numbers here and there and graphs and such, but I think it'll be a reminder of some of what John said, as well as I hope a few other interesting things for you. So clearly we live in a culture which is very focused on material affluence. We've heard this over and over so far this morning, that our goal is to have to borrow John's term, the grossest national product. We have all kinds of messages that tell us that wealth is the way to be happy and successful. We get these messages over and over many times a day from all different kinds of sources. And some would say, and certainly this is something that I've written about, that this is something that's necessary for the maintenance of consumer capitalism. The type of economic social system we have requires us at some level to believe that what's important is to make a lot of money by working a lot of hours so that we can then go and spend some things, spend money on things or services that we want, which then in turn create a profit for the corporations, which then the government can take their tax share off of in order to do the things the government wants to, which can provide jobs so we can work and work more, etc. Okay, so it's all this big cycle and part of what our economic system requires. And we get this reinforced in our minds over and over by the 3,000 commercial impressions that we receive every day. Those data are actually pretty old. I bet it's more than 3,000 nowadays. We receive this all the time from the business policies that we have to work under oftentimes, and then of course from government decisions, which are usually designed to maximize the economy at the cost of pretty much anything else. Now, the thing that we're told about material affluence, as we've also heard, is that it's going to bring all things good. Everybody will have jobs, everybody will be happy. Some people even say we're going to save the environment by growing the economy, okay? Which is just sort of ridiculous when you think about it. But there's all these promises that material affluence holds out for us. And the data, as John mentioned briefly earlier, don't seem to bear that out. So for example, we know that in economically developed nations like ours and in Europe, there is a slight, but very slight, association between how wealthy an individual is and how happy and satisfied they are. This is much less of an effect, however, than something like being in a good marriage or having a job that you like. Those effects are far stronger than income. We also know that among economically developed nations, national wealth doesn't predict national happiness. And I'm going to show you two famous charts which John alluded to in his talk. This one is the curvilinear effect that he was talking about. It comes from data by Engelhardt, but others have shown this over and over again. So here we have basically how happy nations are. Here we have GNP per capita. This is 91 data, but you still find the same thing. Really poor nations tend not to be very happy, and rich nations do tend to be fairly happy. But once you get the GNP of about Ireland in 1991, what you see is that there are no further increases in happiness in any consistent way. So down here is Japan. They live a long time, but they aren't very happy apparently. Okay, and it's, you know, Iceland is just as happy as West Germany. Okay, or is much happier than West Germany, excuse me, even though they have the same income. Ireland is up there with Norway. Okay, well, there's a vast difference in income. Here's another slide. This is called the Easterlin paradox, and it again refers to some data that John told us earlier. This green line is personal income in $95 from 1950 through 1998. So again, you can see that we're a much wealthier nation than we were back in the 50s. This is the percentage of people in nationally representative polls who say they're very happy. Okay? So what happens is though, even though we have this increase in economic growth, that has not translated into increases in happiness, and some data suggest that there's been increases in depression, increases in anxiety during this time as well. Now, there's another false promise of materialism, and this has to do with the material values that people hold. So remember I said a few minutes ago that what's necessary in an economy like ours is to get everybody to believe that money is important, to get everybody to believe that possessions are important, to get everybody to believe that these are worthwhile things to strive for. And what I've been doing for most of my career has been studying that by taking a look at what values people think are or are not important to them. And what we find over and over again, this has been replicated many times by now, is that the more people buy into those materialistic messages, the more they believe that's what's important is to make a lot of money and have a lot of possessions, they're actually less happy. It actually undermines their well-being. And that finding has been replicated in numerous nations by now. We've seen it in kids as young as middle school and adults up into their 80s. We've seen it even for business students and entrepreneurs. Business students who are more materialistic are less happy than business students who aren't so materialistic. The same for business people. And we've also seen it for all different kinds of measures of happiness, like self-actualization and life satisfaction, the reverse of happiness, depression, anxiety, etc. And also for lots of measures of materialism. So clearly we're caught in this mindset that on the one hand, that suggests that wealth and material desires are going to bring us all things good. But what the data show is that hasn't borne itself out. And in fact, it might actually be part of what is holding down our happiness and our well-being. So if that's the case, well, then what does bring us happiness? Okay, if it's not going to be this material stuff, what is the way to go for happiness? Now, as you can see, I think a lot about values. And from my perspective, part of why we're unhappy has to do with materialistic values. So the other kind of values that I've been studying over the years are values that we call intrinsic values. Now, the reason we call these intrinsic values is twofold. The first reason is that, from our perspective, these are pursuits in life which are intrinsically satisfying to pursue. Okay? They're things which you aren't doing for the money. Let's face it, a lot of times you're going to the money for the reward, either from the status or from the actual money you get. Intrinsic values are things you do just because you want to do them, because they're intrinsically satisfying. And the reason they're intrinsically satisfying is, from our theoretical perspective, they satisfy intrinsic psychological needs that we all have, which I'll be talking about here in a little bit. Now, there are three main intrinsic values which we've studied over the years. The first one is self-acceptance. Self-acceptance is the value to pursue your own interests, to pursue your own personal growth, to know and like yourself, to feel competent at the kinds of things that are important for you to feel competent at. I don't need to feel like a competent tennis player because I don't care about tennis, but I need to feel like I'm a competent professor, a competent father, because those are things that matter to me. And I need to have the chance to do things that I find interesting and enjoyable. A second intrinsic aspiration is what we call affiliation. This is the desire to have good relationships with your family, your friends, your lovers, the people who are close to you. And then the third is community feeling. This is about contributing to the broader world, helping the broader world be a bigger place. So it's not just about helping your kid or helping your wife or helping your friend. It's about trying to help people in other nations or in other parts of the world, maybe even to help other species. Okay, so it's this sense of connection with something larger. And what the research has shown over and over and over again is that the more the people orient their lives around these intrinsic values, the happier they are. So materialistic values undermine people's well-being, it seems, whereas the pursuit of intrinsic values appears to support and perhaps enhance people's happiness. Now, what's the resource which is needed in order to pursue your intrinsic values? Okay, it's time. All right? You know, what we're told over and over again is what we need is money for all the resources, for all the things that we need. Okay? And that's where the material affluence way of going has led us. But actually, it's the case that what we need in order to pursue these intrinsic values which make us happy is time. We need time. I mean, this woman needed a little bit of money to buy her paints and her canvas, but she needs the time in order to sit there and pursue this personal growth goal of doing something that's fun and interesting, of painting, okay? We need time in order to have good relationships. Relationships are something that need to be nurtured, and it takes time to do that. And we need time to volunteer as well. Okay, as we heard earlier, part of the difficulty of getting people engaged in activism is they're too busy. Okay, we need time in order to be able to pursue those community feeling values. So again, I was already doing all of this intrinsic, extrinsic work before I met John, but then it was in talking with John that I started to think about time as a resource in this way. And being a scientifically oriented person, I thought, well, let me go ahead and start to test out these things and see if there's a way that we can get some empirical data to support these ideas. And so I came up with two basic hypotheses that I want to share some data with you about here in a minute. The first is that time is a resource that's necessary for happiness. Now, if time is a resource, some of us have a lot of it, and others of us have less of it. So just like some people are materially wealthy or affluent, and other people are materially poor or in poverty, some of us are time affluent, and some of us have time poverty. And so perhaps that would be associated with happiness and well-being. And then I figured, well, if my logic here is correct, then what we should find is that the reason that time is benefiting well-being is because time gives us the opportunity to pursue those intrinsic values, to be able to have the time to go and do things that build up our self-acceptance, our desire to pursue interesting things, to build our relationships, and to build our civic connections. So I want to tell you about a few studies which have tested these ideas. Two of them come from a paper that I published with Ken Sheldon in the Journal of Business Ethics last year. And I'm just going to tell you about study 3 and study 4. This was a multi-study paper. This first study, which was study 3, was done with 106 students at the college where I teach, Knox College. And what we asked people to do is to come into the lab, and they filled out a questionnaire. And every question that they asked, except like gender doesn't usually change in the last 24 hours, but sometimes, okay? But everything else was about what happens for you in the last 24 hours. Now, we measured well-being with the standard triumvirate of 3 different well-being measures. Can you guys see down here? Not really? Okay, yeah, this is not well positioned for that. So the 3 main well-being measures were life satisfaction. This is a sample item. I've been satisfied with my life in the last 24 hours. Positive affect, how much pleasure and joy have you experienced in the last 24 hours, and negative affect, how much have you been unhappy, angry, hostile in the last 24 hours. Then what we wanted to do was to try to measure people's feelings of material versus time affluence. So we made up a brand new scale called MATIS, the Material and Time Affluence Scale. It has 16 items, 8 of which measure time affluence and 8 of which measure material affluence. So we tried to make them as exactly parallel as possible. So I've had plenty of spare time in the last 24 hours. I've had plenty of spare money. I felt like things have been really hectic. I felt pretty poor. I've had enough time to do what I need to do. I've had enough money to buy what I need to buy, okay, etc. So those were the kinds of items that we had to measure the extent to which people both felt a sense of time affluence and a sense of material affluence. Then we measured those variables that had to do with explaining why time affluence might lead to greater happiness. And these, in scientific parlance, are called mediational variables. They sit in between other variables, the predictor variable, in this case time affluence, and the outcome variable, in this case happiness. We looked at, as I mentioned, psychological needs here before. What we did was we assessed the 3 activities the person had done the most in the last 24 hours other than sleep, and we had them write them down, and then we said, okay, how free and autonomous did you feel versus how much were you doing this just because you had to, okay? And also, how competent did you feel? Now, hopefully you remember that those are things which have to do with those self-acceptance goals, of pursuing your own interests and feeling good about what you're after. Then we also asked how related you felt to other people in the last 24 hours. Okay, so that gets at those affiliation goals. We didn't have anything for community feeling in this study. I also need to mention that this isn't really what this talk is mostly about, but we also assessed the extent to which people felt mindful in the last 24 hours. One of the things I find is that when I get really busy, it's hard to stay present-centered. I'm thinking about the future, I'm thinking about the past, I'm all over the place, I'm spilling my tea all over myself, I'm walking down the hallway and I turn left when I meant to turn right, etc. Okay? And I think we've all had that sort of experience. So we also figure that maybe people who didn't have time affluence were less mindful as well. Now, here's what we found. First thing we found was, at least in this sample, that people who felt like they had material affluence also felt like they had time affluence. So that was fairly interesting. We weren't focused on that necessarily. And then we did something that's called a simultaneous regression. This is a statistical technique. I won't bore you with the details. But what we found was that happiness, subjective well-being, is what SWB stands for, a mix of life satisfaction, pleasant emotion, and not negative emotion, was best predicted here by time affluence, but not by material affluence. So people who felt time affluent were happier in the last 24 hours. And then we found that the reason for this had largely to do with their need satisfaction, those intrinsic values, and mindfulness. So what we found is that people who reported high levels of time affluence reported that they felt more mindful in the last 24 hours, and they felt like their needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness were better satisfied. And that's mostly why they were happier. Okay? There also is what's called a direct effect here. But essentially what this shows is that time affluence's effects on well-being happen through mindfulness and through need satisfaction. In study 4, we looked at a bunch of adults because obviously college students, you know, they're not in the regular workforce. Their money isn't as big of a deal for them, perhaps. So we asked, well, what happens if you look at adults? We asked the same 3 well-being measures as before, only here about the last month instead of the last 24 hours. We had them complete the exact same material and time affluence scale, as well as report their income and hours worked for a sort of more objective way of measuring material and time affluence. And then we had those same measures of mindfulness. You probably again can't see this. And we changed a little bit how we measured those intrinsic activities. We said, how much have you spent some time in the last month pursuing self-acceptance goals, affiliation, etc. Now here, what we found was that, again, wealthier people reported more time affluence. Makes some sense. We found now that time affluence and material affluence predicted people's well-being. Okay, so both of them matter. And we got the same results if we used income and work hours. So people, if you looked simultaneously at people's work hours and their income, wealthier people were a little happier, but people who reported working more hours in the last month were less happy, even after controlling for their income. And once again, we found the same mediational effect. Time affluence predicted feeling more mindful and having more time for your intrinsic activities, and that's what made you happier. Now, another way to look at this kind of issue is through the weekend effect, which John mentioned a little while ago. Okay, and this again is a long-standing finding in the research that people report being happier certainly on Saturdays, sometimes Friday afternoons, sometimes Sunday mornings. Sometimes you don't find the effect on Sunday afternoon or evening, by the way, because people are thinking about going back to work, okay? But definitely Saturday and Sunday morning people tend to report greater happiness than the rest of the week. In a recent study, Rich Ryan and his colleagues looked at this again. Here's what they did. They had 83 adults who 3 times a day they would get a beep, okay, from a pager that they were carrying around. They'd get one beep at a random time in the morning, another one at a random time in the middle of the day, another one at a random time in the evening. And when they got that, and that went on for 3 weeks, 21 days of that, okay? And we paid them a fair bit of money to do this, by the way. And what they had to fill out every time they got beeped was, what's your emotional state right now? Okay, how much pleasant mood do you have right now? How much unpleasant mood do you have right now? How vital and alive do you feel right now? And how much are you feeling autonomous and competent right now? Remember, those are those self-acceptance goals. And how much are you feeling connected to other people right now? Well, they found, again, that like other people had, happier on the weekend than on the weekday. And this was mostly mediated by need satisfaction. So here again what we have, the end of the day versus a weekday. On weekends, you feel more autonomous. Imagine that. You're doing what you want to do instead of what you're forced to do or what you have to do in order to earn money. You're also feeling more connected to people. And that it largely explains what your pleasant mood is, completely explains how much negative mood you feel. Okay? Completely explains the weekend effect on negative mood, and mostly explains the weekend effect on feelings of vitality. Now, in a study that was just published, literally, it came to my attention 4 days before I started work on this talk. Everything that I've told you so far is correlational. And if you remember Introduction to Psychology, if you ever taught it, hopefully one of the things your professor taught you is that from correlational data you cannot make conclusions about causation. Okay? Maybe people who get their needs satisfied decide they're going to be time affluent, or maybe happy people decide they're going to be time affluent. Cassie Mogilner did a study that is our first data to my knowledge. Do you know the study yet, John? It's the first data to my knowledge which has shown anything experimental, which talks about the happiness benefits of time. So here's what she did. This is the last study in the paper, and it was done at a college café. And so here's how the study worked. There was an experimenter standing outside of the college café with a bunch of questionnaires. And people are coming into the café, and as people walk into the café, the experimenter says, "Hey, will you be in my study?" And the person says yes, okay? And if they're going to be in the study, they're put into one of three groups. They don't know there are three groups, but they're put into one of three groups. In all of the groups, what happens is that people are presented with a bunch of mixed up words and told to shift those words around in order to make a meaningful phrase. Now, a third of the subjects get phrases like this: sheets that change clock, where there's a word in there that has to do with time. Another third of the subjects get words that have money in them. Here it's price. And then the control group gets a neutral word, socks. So what the task is to unscramble the words so that you get something like this. Okay? So the time people, the people in the time group over and over are getting words like clock and hour and whatever. People in the money group over and over words, price, dollar, and then the neutral group, socks and shoes, I guess. Okay, then what happens is subject walks into the cafe, thinks the study is over, but it's not, because there's an experimenter sitting there who observes people when they come into the cafe. And when they come into the cafe, they are ignored, basically. Okay, nobody pays any attention to them, especially, but the observer watches what they do and records the number of minutes that they either spent socializing or working. Okay? So, and they're able to see their computer screen even to know what they're doing on the computer. The subject doesn't know what's going on. Afterwards, the subject leaves the cafe. Some people left in 2 minutes, some people left in 2 hours. And the experimenter who was outside at first comes up and says, "Oh, there's one more thing I'd like you to do. Will you fill out this happiness questionnaire?" And so they fill it out. So essentially what has happened in this study is some people have been led to think about time, some people have been led to think about money, and some people have been led to think about socks, okay? Something neutral. Now, what did Mogilner find? Well, here's the effects on behavior. People, this is time, control group, socks, and money. People who had been forced to think about time spent about 60% of their time socializing. People who thought about money spent about 25% of their time socializing, with the control group in the middle. People who had been asked to think about time spent less than 10% of their time working. People who had been asked to think about money spent 40% of their time working. just thinking about time versus money affected whether or not you socialized or worked while you were in the cafe. Now, socializing, of course, gets at one of those intrinsic aspirations, right? The one for affiliation. So therefore, what you also found, and I'll show you the therefore in a second, this is how happy they were when they left the cafe. People who had just been asked to think about time were significantly happier than those who thought about money or socks. And we got a mediational effect too. People who thought about time instead of money spent more time socializing, and that's why they were happier. This is just thinking about time, folks. People who thought about time spent their time differently. They spent their time on intrinsic activities, and that made them happier. And it's an experiment, okay? And so you can make good causal conclusions. Very briefly, how much time do I have left? Great. I just want to very briefly mention a few other outcomes that other research that I or others have done has shown is associated with feeling like you have more time. Job satisfaction and stress, health, which we've heard about, and ecological outcomes. First, with regard to job satisfaction. Now, the data here aren't as clear in terms of the role of intrinsic values because people haven't looked at these mediational pathways yet. But we know from past research that the more people focus on intrinsic values, then they have more satisfactions on the job. They're doing things that seem meaningful, they like their coworkers, etc. Ron Burke did a study with 877 managers and professionals in Turkey, and he found that time affluence predicted higher job satisfaction and lower job stress. So the workers in Turkey who felt like they had more time were more satisfied with their jobs and less stressed at their jobs. Health. We also know that intrinsic values, people who focus on intrinsic values report fewer physical symptoms, and they also do less things like smoke and drink, which are bad for your health. And there is some research out there which has shown in that same Turkish manager study, the managers who had a lot of time affluence had fewer physical symptoms. Same thing happened on weekends, by the way. Okay, people on weekends report fewer physical symptoms than they do during the weekday. Finally, ecological outcomes. We know from a vast amount of research, not vast, but a fair bit amount of research, that people who focus on intrinsic values care more about the environment. They're more likely to engage in environmentally responsible behaviors. They're less greedy. They have lower ecological footprints. Here's just a real quick graph from 308 U.S. adults that shows work hours and ecological footprints. So what you can see is that people who work under 40 hours a week have smaller ecological footprints than those who work over 40. Okay? Recent studies have shown this at the national level too. So Anders Hayden, who's actually a former student of Julie Shore's, did a study in 50 nations and found that national economic footprints were associated with work hours. Higher work hours, higher footprints. We'll skip this. Summary, I hope you've seen that time affluence supports these good things, and that may well be because it gives them the chance, gives time affluent people the chance to focus on their intrinsic goals. So as we think about policy, let's not think just about time, let's also think about time to pursue the intrinsic goals, because that seems to be a big part of the active ingredient. Thank you for your attention.